You ever overheard a conversation you really weren't supposed to? If you overheard your own son making secret plans about your future without telling you, the kind that makes your heart race, your palms sweat, and your mind spiral into 1,000 what-ifs. Well, let me tell you about the week my life turned upside down, all because my son thought I was asleep. It was one of those nights when sleep just wouldn't come, no matter how many times I fluffed my pillow or counted backwards from 100. You know, the kind when your mind is racing with grocery lists, doctor's appointments, and whether you remembered to turn off the stove. I'd been lying there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator down the hall and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I was just about to give up and reach for my book when I heard it, a soft, almost conspiratorial whisper coming from the hallway. At first I thought maybe I was imagining things. After all, my son David was a grown man, not a teenager sneaking in after curfew. But there it was again, the unmistakable sound of his voice, low and urgent, as if he was trying not to wake me. I strained to listen, curiosity getting the better of me. That's when I heard the words, "That would change everything. Yes, love, come live with us. My mother is retired and will help with our expenses." I nearly choked on my own spit. Help with our expenses. Was I a walking, talking 401k? Now, I lay there frozen, pretending to snore while my mind did somersaults. Was I about to become the world's oldest living babysitter, or worse, a human ATM? I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a mix of fear and disbelief washing over me. I'd always prided myself on being there for my family, but this was something else entirely. I tried to piece together what I'd just heard. David had always been responsible, the kind of son who called every Sunday and never forgot my birthday. But lately I'd noticed a certain tension in his voice, a heaviness. That hadn't been there before. His wife Emily was lovely, smart, funny, and always quick with a hug, but I knew they'd been struggling a bit since she lost her job last year. Still, I never imagined they'd consider moving in with me, let alone expect me to help foot the bill. As I lay there, my mind raced through every possible scenario. Would they take over my cozy little house, rearrange my furniture, and fill my fridge with almond milk and kale? Would I be relegated to the guest room, my favorite armchair, replaced by a modern monstrosity that looked good, but felt like sitting on a rock? And what about my book club, my garden, my precious quiet mornings with the crossword and a cup of coffee? Would all of that disappear, swallowed up by the chaos of a full house? I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe David was just being polite, offering a temporary solution until they got back on their feet. But the more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. I'd worked hard for my retirement, finally, reaching a point where I could enjoy the little things, long walks, lazy afternoons, and the freedom to do as I pleased. The thought of giving all that up, of becoming the family safety net, filled me with a dread I hadn't felt in years. Of course there was another part of me, the motherly part that wanted to help. I remembered all the times David had come to me with scraped knees and broken hearts, how I'd always managed to make things better with a hug and a homemade cookie, but this was different. This wasn't a skinned knee or a bad grade. This was my life, my home, and my hard-earned peace at stake. I lay there torn between love and self-preservation, wondering how I'd gotten to this point. Was this what retirement was supposed to look like? Trading in my golden years for a second round of parenting. I thought about my friends. Some of them had their kids move back in, and I'd heard the horror stories. One friend's son had turned her living room into a home gym, complete with a punching bag and a set of weights that left permanent dents in her hardwood floors. Another friend's daughter had taken over the kitchen, banning all carbs and insisting on meatless Mondays, which in her words really cleansed the energy of the house. I shuddered at the thought. As the minutes ticked by, I realized I had a decision to make. I could confront David in the morning, demand an explanation, and set some ground rules. Or I could wait, see how things played out and hope for the best. Either way, I knew things were about to change, and not necessarily for the better. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off to sleep. My dreams filled with images of moving trucks, endless grocery bills, and a never-ending chorus of "Mom, can you help me with this?" When I woke up the next morning, the house was quiet, the only evidence of the previous night's conversation, a faint echo in my mind, but I knew deep down that the peace and quiet I'd come to cherish was about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. As I sipped my coffee and stared out the window at the garden I'd worked so hard to cultivate, I couldn't help but wonder, was I ready for this next chapter? Or was it time to finally put myself first, even if it meant saying no to the people I loved most? The answer I suspected would come sooner than I thought. The next morning I woke up with a plan. I was determined to get to the bottom of this, come live with us, business before my house turned into a commune, but as it turned out, my son David had plans of his own, namely to avoid me like I was the IRS, and he'd just forgotten to file his taxes. For the last 5 years, gone were our usual morning coffee chats, the ones where he'd ask about my back or tease me about my crossword puzzle addiction. Instead, I was greeted by closed doors, muffled voices, and the distinct sense that I was being tiptoed around in my own home. At first, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe David was just busy. Maybe he was arcing on a surprise for Emily's birthday, or maybe he'd finally taken up meditation and needed some alone time. But after the third day of being treated like a piece of antique furniture, nice to look at but best left undisturbed, I knew something was up. Every time I entered a room, David would find a reason to leave. If I went into the kitchen, he'd suddenly remember he needed to check the mail. If I wandered into the living room, he'd be halfway up the stairs. Before I could even say hello, it was like living with a ghost, only this one left dirty coffee cups in the sink and never refilled the sugar jar. I tried to catch him in the act, hoping to corner him and force a conversation. I'd pop into the kitchen at odd hours, pretending to look for a snack, but he'd vanish, faster than my favorite cookies at a family reunion. I even started making up excuses to linger in the hallway dusting picture frames that hadn't seen a cloth in years just to see if I could overhear another snippet of his secret plans. But David was always one step ahead, slipping away with the stealth of a seasoned cat burglar. By the 4th day, I was starting to feel like a character in one of those old spy movies, paranoid, jumpy, and convinced that everyone was in on a plot except me. I found myself eavesdropping at doors, peeking around corners, and even checking the trash for clues. For the record, all I found was a suspicious number of takeout containers and a half-eaten bag of kale chips. So much for healthy living. I even started talking to my houseplants for company. Don't judge their great listeners. And at least they don't run away when I walk into the room. It was during one of these one-sided conversations with my fern Gladys that I started to wonder if I was being paranoid. Maybe David really was just busy. Maybe I was reading too much into things, but then I'd catch a glimpse of him and Emily, huddled together in the backyard, whispering and glancing nervously at the house, and my suspicions would flare up all over again. What were they planning? A surprise party? A home renovation, or more likely, a full-scale invasion of my peaceful post-retirement life? I tried to distract myself with my usual routines, watering the garden, reading the paper, and catching up on my favorite mystery novels. But even Agatha Christie couldn't hold my attention for long. My mind kept drifting back to David and his secretive behavior. I started to imagine all sorts of scenarios, each more dramatic than the last. Maybe they were planning to turn my house into a daycare, center complete with sticky-fingered toddlers and endless rounds of Baby Shark. Or maybe they were plotting to redecorate, replacing my beloved floral wallpaper with something modern and minimalist. The horror. By the 5th day, my nerves were shot. I'd had enough of the silent treatment, the closed doors, and the constant feeling that I was being left out of my own life. I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. If David wouldn't talk to me, I'd force the issue. I waited until I heard him in the kitchen, then marched in with all the confidence I could muster. "Morning, David," I said, trying to sound casual. "Sleep well," he jumped, like I'd caught him stealing cookies from the jar. "Oh, hi, Mom. Yeah, fine. Just, making some coffee." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You know, it's been awfully quiet around here lately. Almost too quiet. Anything you want to tell me?" He avoided my gaze, fiddling with the coffee pot. "Nope, nothing. Just busy with work." "You know how it is." I raised an eyebrow. "Uh-huh." And all those phone calls, the whispering, the sudden interest in the backyard. He flushed, mumbling something about needing fresh air. I almost laughed my son, the master of avoidance, reduced to a stammering mess by his own mother. But I held my ground, determined not to let him off the hook. "David, I'm not blind or deaf. If something's going on, I'd like to know about it. This is my house after all." He finally looked at me, guilt written all over his face, for a moment. I thought he might spill the beans right then and there, but instead he just muttered, "I promise, Mom, we'll talk soon. Just give me a little more time." "Okay?" I sighed, realizing I wasn't going to get any answers. Not yet, anyway. But as I watched him scurry out of the kitchen, I felt a strange mix of frustration and amusement. My peaceful post-retirement life was clearly under threat. But I couldn't help but feel a little excited too. After all, who knew what the next few days would bring? One thing was certain. I was ready for whatever came next, even if it meant talking to my houseplants. A little longer, as I watered Gladys and gave her leaves a gentle pat. I whispered, "Don't worry, old girl. We'll get to the bottom of this, one way or another." And with that, I braced myself for the next chapter, whatever it might hold. Monday morning dawned bright and early, but I was already up, nerves jangling and heart pounding like a marching band. I'd barely slept the night before, replaying every conversation, every suspicious glance, every closed door. I'd finally decided that if my son and daughter-in-law were going to turn my peaceful retirement into a group project, I was going to set the tone from the very start. So while the world was still dark and quiet, I'd been out in the yard, paintbrush in hand, channeling all my anxiety and a good bit of mischief into a project of my own. By the time the sun peeked over the fence, my masterpiece was finished. A giant hand-painted sign, propped up right in the middle of the front yard. Impossible to miss. I stood back and admired my handiwork, a grin spreading across my face. "Welcome to the retirement resort. All guests must contribute 1 load of laundry, 2 home-cooked meals and unlimited foot rubs per week. No freeloaders allowed. I even added a few smiley faces and a cartoon foot for good measure. If they were going to move in, they were going to know exactly what they were signing up for." I barely had time to pour myself a cup of coffee before I heard it, the unmista. Cable rumble of a moving truck coming up the driveway. My stomach did a little flip. This was it. The moment of truth. I peeked out the window and saw David and Emily standing at the gate, surrounded by enough suitcases to outfit a small army. They were beaming, practically glowing with excitement, like they'd just won the lottery or been told they were the next contestants on a game show. I almost felt bad for what was about to happen almost. They opened the gate, still chatting and laughing, but the second their eyes landed on my sign, everything changed. Emily's mouth dropped open, her suitcase slipping from her hand and landing with a thud on the walkway. David's smile froze, then slowly melted into a look of pure horror, as if he just realized he'd walked into a surprise math test. For a split second, I thought they might turn around and run for the hills, leaving their luggage and their plans behind. I stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, trying to look as nonchalant as possible. "Good morning," I called, waving cheerfully. "Welcome to the retirement resort. I see you brought plenty of luggage. I hope you packed your aprons and your best foot," rubbing hands. David blinked, clearly at a loss for words. Emily looked from the sign to me and back again, her cheeks turning a shade of pink. I hadn't seen since her wedding day. For a moment nobody said anything. The only sound was the distant chirping of birds and the soft hiss of the moving truck's engine. Finally, David managed to find his voice. Mum, what's all this?" I took a long sip of coffee, savoring the moment. Well, I figured if we're all going to be living together, we should set some ground rules. Make sure everyone pulls their weight. Retirement isn't a free ride. After all, Emily let out a nervous laugh, glancing at David for support. We didn't realize you'd be so prepared. Oh, I'm always prepared, I said, giving them my best mom look. You two have been sneaking around for days, whispering and plotting I may be retired, but I'm not senile if you... You want to move in? You're going to have to earn your keep. This isn't a hotel and I'm not room service. David looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. We just thought, we thought it would be easier for everyone. Save money, help each other out. I nodded, softening a little, I get it. Honey, times are tough, but I've spent my whole life taking care of other people. I was looking forward to a little peace and quiet, maybe even a hobby or two that doesn't involve laundry or cooking for a crowd. If we're going to do this, it has to work for all of us. That means sharing the load, literally and figuratively. Emily bent down to pick up her suitcase, still looking a bit shell-shocked. I guess we should have talked to you first. I smiled, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Communication is key, sweetheart. If we're going to live together, we need to be honest about what we all need, and I need to know. I'm not just the built-in babysitter or the family ATM. David finally cracked a smile, the tension easing from his shoulders. So does this mean we're still welcome? I laughed, the sound echoing across the yard. Of course you're welcome, but you'd better brush up on your laundry skills, and I hope you like my famous meatloaf because you're both on dinner duty this week. We all stood there for a moment, the three of us, surrounded by suitcases and the ridiculous sign, and I felt something shift. The fear and resentment I'd been carrying all week started to melt away, replaced by a cautious optimism. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe with a little humor and a lot of honesty we could make this work. As we started hauling suitcases inside, I caught David glancing at the sign and shaking his head, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Emily laughed, promising to give the best foot rubs in the county, and me. I felt a little lighter, a little braver, and a whole lot more ready for whatever this new chapter might bring, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that family is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes downright exhausting, but it's also the best adventure there is. And as long as we're all in it together, I think we'll be just fine. After the initial shock wore off, and after we'd all had a good laugh, at the retirement resort sign, which David threatened to post on social media for all his friends to see, we did what my family has always done. In times of crisis, we sat down for coffee. There's something about the ritual of pouring a hot cup, passing around the sugar, and settling into our favorite chairs that makes even the most awkward conversations a little easier. I could see the nerves still flickering in David's eyes, and Emily kept glancing at the sign through the window, as if it might sprout legs and chase her down the driveway, but I knew this was the moment to set the tone for our new life together. I took a deep breath, looked at both of them, and said, I love you both, but this isn't a free ride. If we're going to live together, we're going to do it as a team, and yes, I am retired, but I'm not retired from living my own life. I watched as the words sank in. There was a pause, the kind that feels like it stretches on forever, and then Emily nodded, her face softening with relief. David let out a breath he'd probably been holding for a week. We started talking, really talking. For the first time since this whole adventure began, I told them about my worries, about losing my independence, about becoming the default housekeeper, about my precious quiet mornings and my book club nights. Emily admitted she'd been terrified of imposing, that she'd been raised to never burden anyone, and that she was afraid I'd resent her for moving in. David, bless his heart, confessed that he'd been so focused on fixing things for everyone that he'd forgotten to ask what I actually wanted. We all laughed at that, because isn't that just the way with families? We try so hard to help each other that we sometimes forget to just listen, so we made a plan. Not a my house, my rules kind of plan, but a Al grown up, everyone has a say plan. We divvied up the chores. David, who'd always been a whiz with a vacuum, took over the floors and the trash. Emily, who could whip up a casserole out of 3 random ingredients, and a can of soup volunteered for most of the cooking. With me as her trusty sous chef and occasional taste tester, I agreed to handle the garden and the laundry, but only if someone else folded the fitted sheets, because honestly, who has the patience for that? We talked about money too, which is never easy, but we did it anyway. We set up a little house fund for groceries and bills, with everyone contributing what they could. No more secret stress, no more silent resentment, just honesty and a promise to check in every month to make sure things were still working for everyone. And then most importantly, we talked about me time. I told them as kindly as I could that I needed space, time for my morning walks, my book club, my garden, and the occasional afternoon nap. Emily grinned and said she'd been hoping for the same thing. And David sheepishly admitted he'd been looking forward to having a little time to himself, too. We agreed to respect each other's boundaries, to knock before entering closed doors, and to never, ever interrupt a good nap unless the house was on fire. It wasn't all serious, of course. There were plenty of jokes about foot rubs and laundry disasters, and David even tried to bribe Emily into taking his turn with the dishes. We laughed until our sides hurt, and for the first time in days, I felt the tension melt away. This wasn't the retirement I'd imagined, but maybe it could be even better. The first week was a learning curve, to say the least. There were a few hiccups, like the time Emily accidentally shrank my favourite sweater, or when David tried to help in the garden and pulled up all my tulips, thinking they were weeds. But there were also unexpected joys, family dinners filled with laughter, evenings spent watching old movies, and quiet, mornings where we each did our own thing together but separate in the best possible way. I realized that setting boundaries didn't mean shutting people out. It meant making space for everyone, including myself. It meant saying yes to help, but also saying yes to my own needs. It meant learning to ask for what I wanted and trusting that the people I love would listen. And maybe most importantly, it meant letting go of the idea that I had to do everything myself. Now as I sit in my favorite chair, coffee in hand and the house humming, with the gentle chaos of family life, I feel a sense of peace I didn't know I was missing. We're not perfect, no family is, but we're figuring it out one day at a time. And I know that whatever comes next, we'll face it together. So let me ask you, have you ever had to lay down the law with your grown kids, or maybe you've been the one moving back in? There's a difference between generosity and being taken for granted. She gave with love, they demanded with greed, but life has a way of teaching the ungrateful. And this time, the lesson came with a locked door and silence. A woman's quiet strength is never weakness. It's warning. Thank you for watching this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. I truly value every story and every voice. Don't forget to subscribe to Tears and Strength and share this video with your friends.